Something just happened that nobody saw coming. Canada made a move that caught the entire Western world off guard. On Tuesday, February 3rd, 2026, Montreal made an announcement that changed everything. They didn't ask politely. They didn't wait their turn. They stepped forward and said they want to host NATO's new massive defense bank. This isn't just any bank. We're talking about the institution that will control billions of dollars for military projects across 40 countries. And Canada is claiming it should be on their land. What I'm about to reveal will completely change how you see power in the Western alliance. For 7 decades, the system was straightforward. America holds the money. America calls the shots. Everyone else listens and follows. That's how NATO operated. That's how defense funding worked. The entire Western system was built around American financial control. Montreal just broke that system wide open. Here's exactly what went down. Stephen P. walked into Montreal's international headquarters and made a statement that shocked every NATO capital city. He said Montreal is the only city in Canada that has everything needed to host the Defense Security and Resilience Bank. Notice the language. He didn't say, "We hope you'll consider us." He didn't say, "We'd be grateful for the opportunity." He said, "We're the right choice." Period. Then they backed up their claim with facts Washington didn't expect. Almost 70 international organizations already work in Montreal. 6 United Nations offices operate there. NATO's Climate Change and Security Center is already headquartered in the city. The aerospace industry there can manufacture a complete aircraft from beginning to end. Financial systems that match anything found in North America. But things got messy fast. Montreal wasn't the only Canadian city jumping into this fight. Toronto entered the competition. Ontario Premier Doug Ford gave his complete backing to Toronto's proposal. Same bank, same contest, Canada against Canada. Then it got even more complicated. Ottawa threw their hat in the ring. Vancouver submitted their own bid. 4 major Canadian cities, all telling NATO the same thing: choose us. Choose Canada, but specifically choose us over the other Canadian cities. From NATO's viewpoint, this is perfect. Competition creates better offers, stronger facilities, more attractive deals. But from America's viewpoint, this reveals something they wanted to keep hidden. Canada is no longer sitting around waiting for American permission on financial matters. They're not asking if they're allowed to join big financial decisions. They're demanding to be at the table where those decisions happen, and they're proving they have the infrastructure, knowledge, and political strength to back it up. This is the detail that kept me thinking all night. The federal government in Ottawa didn't choose sides between these cities. Instead, they appointed Isabelle Houdan to represent all Canadian interests in this competition. Let me tell you who she is. Former ambassador to France, former president of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, current CEO of the Business Development Bank of Canada, managing $40 billion in assets, and someone who completely understands how Prime Minister Mark Carney thinks about financial independence. Because that's what this really comes down to. Mark Carney didn't become Prime Minister just to keep things the same. He came back to Canadian politics in March 2025 with a clear plan: completely restructure Canada's position in Western finance, move from depending on American institutions to partnering with American institutions, and when needed, competing directly with American institutions. The Defense Security and Resilience Bank bid shows that plan in action. Canada isn't asking NATO to include them. Canada is positioning themselves to be where the decisions get made. What happened next proves this isn't just political theater. Quebec Premier François Legault endorsed Montreal's bid. Mayor Valérie Plante publicly backed it. Minister Christopher Skeete threw Quebec's full weight behind it. That's standard political procedure so far. But then both candidates running for leadership of Coalition Avenir Québec, Bernard Drainville and Christine Fréchette, immediately supported the bid before their leadership race even finished. That's not politics. That's complete agreement. Quebec's entire political establishment across different parties and factions saying this bank matters more than their internal fights. This is Canada's moment, and they're refusing to let disagreements ruin it. Now, here's what people aren't discussing. This bank isn't some symbolic NATO office with no real power. The Defense Security and Resilience Bank is the institution designed to fund military projects across all member countries. This is where billions in defense infrastructure spending will be organized and directed. This is where purchasing decisions get financed. When Poland needs radar systems, they come here. When Norway needs Arctic monitoring equipment, they come here. When any of 40 NATO and Indo-Pacific countries need money for F-35 purchases, cyber defense networks, or dual-use technology, they come to this bank. Whoever hosts this institution doesn't just get prestige and recognition. They get close access to every major defense contract discussion in the Western Alliance. They get the financial information that comes from seeing where money moves before it moves. They get the relationships that form when defense ministers and procurement officials are constantly visiting your city for meetings. Wall Street understood this immediately. So did Frankfurt and London. That's why Montreal's aggressive push caught everyone completely off guard. Here's where the story gets truly fascinating. Canada didn't just show up with big dreams. They showed up with infrastructure nobody realized they had built. Montreal's pitch to NATO isn't theoretical. It's ready to operate now. The city already hosts almost 70 international organizations. They're already running 6 United Nations offices. They've already been managing NATO's Climate Change and Security Center of Excellence for years. This isn't a city learning how to handle international institutions. This is a city that's been doing it successfully while everyone focused on New York and Brussels. And then there's the aerospace industry. Montreal is the only place in North America where you can construct an entire aircraft from start to finish in one city. Bombardier operates there. CAE, the world's largest flight simulator manufacturer, is there. Pratt and Whitney Canada, Rolls-Royce Canada, all running major facilities in the same area. When NATO procurement officials need to evaluate defense aviation projects, they already know Montreal's capabilities. But that's not even the real story here. The real story is what this competition reveals about Canada's defense industry transformation. For decades, Canadian defense companies hit a wall. Banks refused to work with them. Too risky. Not our sector, reputation concerns. Defense contractors in Canada were literally losing their banking relationships just because they worked in defense. Reports indicate that Kevin Reed, president of the Defense Security and Resilience Bank Development Group, told a federal committee exactly this. Companies were losing banking services simply because they worked in defense. That created a massive problem. Canadian companies had the technical skills to compete globally, but they couldn't access the money to grow. Now, what I'm about to show you changes everything, because the DSRB isn't just about financing NATO projects. It's about creating an entirely new financial system for defense innovation. And whoever hosts it controls how that system develops. Think about what that means in reality. When procurement officials from Poland, Germany, Norway, and the Baltic states are regularly flying to Montreal or Toronto for financing meetings, they're not just attending board meetings. They're touring facilities, they're meeting with Canadian aerospace companies, they're sitting down with Canadian defense contractors, they're evaluating Canadian technology firms for potential partnerships. The relationships that form in bank boardrooms create opportunities in defense contracts. Canada's defense industry has always been capable. They just competed from the sidelines while American and European giants captured the biggest contracts. Hosting this bank changes the competitive landscape completely. Montreal's pitch specifically emphasizes this combined advantage. Sources confirm they're not just selling hosting ability, they're selling expertise. You want defense financing? We offer that. You want aerospace expertise to evaluate technical proposals. We have that. You want financial modeling that understands military procurement timelines. We've been doing that for decades. Wall Street offers capital. Montreal offers capital plus strategic defense knowledge. That's a completely different value proposition. And Washington is quietly realizing something uncomfortable. If Canada successfully hosts this bank, the next logical move is expanding Canadian involvement in NATO's other financial infrastructure, the NATO Infrastructure Fund, the Defense Investment Pledge mechanisms, the collaborative procurement programs. Each represents billions in annual money flows. Each creates opportunities for the host country's financial sector. Each builds relationships that translate into broader economic influence. And each has historically been managed through American or European centers, maintaining traditional power structures. Canada hosting the DSRB doesn't just break that pattern, it establishes a precedent. If Montreal or Toronto proves they can effectively manage NATO defense financing, every other alliance financial function becomes fair game for Canadian bids. But here's the twist nobody expected. The European Union is watching this closely, because if Canada successfully positions as NATO's financial partner rather than America's financial dependent, that creates space for European capitals to similarly assert financial independence. Brussels doesn't want to route everything through New York any more than Ottawa does, but someone had to go first to demonstrate that alternatives are viable. Montreal just volunteered. And whether they win this specific bid or not, the signal has been sent. Canada is competing for financial infrastructure that shapes Western defense policy. Documents reveal that Prime Minister Carney understands something fundamental. Military sovereignty without financial sovereignty is incomplete. You can have the best trained forces, the most advanced equipment, the strongest alliances, but if you're dependent on another country's financial institutions to fund your defense, you're not truly independent. This bank bid is about changing that equation, not just for Canada, but for the entire alliance. Because once one NATO member successfully hosts critical financial infrastructure, others will follow. Poland might bid to host procurement financing for Eastern European members. Norway might offer to manage Arctic defense investment. Spain might compete for Mediterranean security funding. Once that monopoly breaks, whoever got there first controls how the new system gets built. First movers don't just participate, they set the rules. That's what Canada is doing right now. That's what this Montreal bid represents. Financial sovereignty as national strategy. And the quiet recognition across NATO capitals that Canadian leadership under Mark Carney isn't waiting for American permission to pursue Canadian interests. Does this change how you see Canada's role in the Western alliance? Because we're not finished yet. Now we need to talk about the man behind this strategy, because none of this happens without Mark Carney's return to Canadian politics. March 2025, Carney becomes Prime Minister after winning the Liberal Party leadership with over 85% of the vote. The former governor of the Bank of Canada, the former governor of the Bank of England, the first non-British citizen to ever hold that position. He didn't return to Canadian politics to manage small policy changes. He returned with a doctrine, a comprehensive vision for restructuring Canada's position in the global financial system. And what we're learning is that vision includes something very specific. Moving Canada from financial client to financial architect, from policy taker to policymaker, from American satellite to independent power center. The DSRB bid is the operational manifestation of that doctrine. Look at the pattern. When Carney ran the Bank of England from 2013 to 2020, London became the Western world's alternative financial center to New York. Not opposed to New York, but independent of New York, a place where European governments, Asian investors, and global corporations could access Western financial systems without routing everything through Manhattan. Carney built that infrastructure deliberately. Now he's Prime Minister of Canada, and suddenly Montreal is bidding to host NATO's defense bank. Toronto is competing for the same prize. Both cities are highlighting capabilities nobody questioned they had, but nobody thought to position as globally significant until now. That's not coincidence. That's the Carney Doctrine in action. And then came Davos, January 2026. The World Economic Forum. Carney delivered a speech that sent shockwaves through the conference. The latest information shows he declared the old international order is over, not declining, not changing, over. He told middle powers like Canada they need to stop waiting for the rules-based system to protect them and start building new coalitions based on shared interests. Officials are now saying that speech triggered immediate backlash from Washington. President Trump rescinded an invitation for Carney to sit on a proposed board of peace addressing Gaza. Trump later said Canada lives because of the United States and criticized Carney for showing no gratitude. That's not diplomatic language. That's a direct challenge to a sitting prime minister. Carney didn't back down. When Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent claimed Carney had walked back his Davos comments in a phone call with Trump, Carney went on record. I meant what I said. He added that almost nothing is normal in the United States right now. That's Canada's Prime Minister publicly contradicting the U.S. Treasury Secretary and doubling down on his criticism of American behavior. This is where everything connects. The DSRB bid isn't happening in isolation. It's part of a broader strategic repositioning. Carney is systematically building Canada's capacity to operate independently of American financial infrastructure while maintaining alliance commitments, and he's doing it across multiple fronts simultaneously. In January 2026, Carney visited China, first Canadian Prime Minister to do so in 8 years. Sources confirm he met with President Xi Jinping and Premier Li Qiang. They signed 8 cooperation documents, including an economic and trade roadmap. They specifically addressed trade issues around electric vehicles, steel, aluminum, rapeseed, and agricultural products. Washington noticed, because while Trump is threatening Canada with annexation and massive tariffs, Carney is diversifying Canada's economic relationships. He's building alternative markets. He's creating financial partnerships that reduce dependence on American trade. That's the Carney Doctrine in practice. Don't wait for American policy to stabilize. Build systems that work regardless of American chaos. The DSRB bid fits this pattern perfectly. If NATO's defense bank ends up in Montreal or Toronto, Canada gains financial infrastructure that functions independently of American approval. Defense ministers from 40 countries will be dealing with Canadian institutions, Canadian officials, Canadian financial systems. The United States remains the alliance's military backbone, but Canada becomes its financial coordinator. That's a power shift. And Carney knows exactly what he's building because he's done it before. At the Bank of England, he managed Brexit's financial chaos. He navigated the early COVID pandemic. He built systems that kept British finance operational when everyone predicted collapse. Now he's applying that same expertise to Canadian sovereignty. But here's what nobody's talking about. The Business Development Bank of Canada just announced $4 billion in financing specifically for Canada's defense industry, not loans. Strategic investments in small and medium-sized defense companies that have been shut out of traditional banking. The majority of those funds, $3.12 billion, will help Canadian businesses participate in major defense contracts. Reports indicate this creates a domestic defense financing ecosystem before the DSRB decision is even made. Canada isn't waiting to see if they win the NATO bank. They're building the financial infrastructure to support defense innovation regardless. If they win the DSRB bid, that infrastructure integrates seamlessly. If they don't, they still have a functioning system that reduces dependence on American defense finance. That's strategic planning. That's the Carney doctrine. Build independent capacity first. Compete for multilateral institutions second. Never put yourself in a position where American approval is required for Canadian priorities. The implications are staggering because if Canada successfully executes this strategy, other middle powers will copy it. Australia might pursue similar independence in Indo-Pacific defense financing. Poland might build Eastern European defense investment infrastructure. South Korea, Japan, Norway, all watching to see if Canada's model works. And if it does, the American monopoly on Western defense finance doesn't just weaken. It fragments into a network of regional centers, each operating with significant independence. Washington remains the military leader, but financial power distributes across multiple capitals. That's not the alliance America designed in 1949. That's a fundamentally different structure, and Mark Carney is building it piece by piece, starting with a single bank that everyone assumed would naturally go to an American or European city. Wait until you see what comes next. So here's where we are. The decision on the DSRB headquarters will come in the next few months. Multiple cities are competing. The process is ongoing, but regardless of outcome, the transformation has already occurred. Canada went from accepting financial subordination to actively competing for financial power. That shift doesn't reverse. And every NATO country, every defense contractor, every procurement official now understands something they didn't before. When serious financial decisions need to be made, Canada expects to be in the room where it happens. Not observing, not supporting, leading. Let me explain exactly why this matters long term, because the bank itself is just the beginning. What we're really watching is the architecture of Western power being redrawn in real time. For 75 years, the formula was clear. America provides military power and financial infrastructure. Europe provides industrial capacity and political legitimacy. Smaller allies provide bases, support, and compliance. That hierarchy kept the alliance stable through the Cold War, through post-Soviet expansion, through the War on Terror. Everyone knew their role. The latest information shows that formula is breaking down. Not because of external threats, but because of internal American instability. Trump's threats to abandon NATO, his demands for protection payments, his public consideration of annexing allied territory, his sweeping tariff threats that ignore treaty obligations. American behavior under this administration has forced allies to question the reliability of American leadership. Canada's response is the most sophisticated. They're not abandoning the alliance. They're not building alternative security arrangements. They're repositioning within the existing structure to reduce dependence on American financial decisions while maintaining military cooperation. The DSRB bid is the clearest example of that strategy. Think about what hosting this bank actually means in practice. When Poland needs to finance a major radar system, they work with Canadian institutions. When Norway needs Arctic surveillance infrastructure, they negotiate with Canadian officials. When Baltic states need cyber defense networks, they coordinate through Canadian financial systems. The United States remains the primary weapons supplier and security guarantor, but Canada becomes the financial intermediary. That creates relationships, that creates leverage, that creates the kind of soft power that translates into influence across the entire alliance. and it does so without directly challenging American military primacy, which means Washington can't frame it as disloyalty or free riding. That's brilliant strategic positioning. Carney is building Canadian power in the spaces America doesn't occupy, using methods America can't credibly oppose. How do you argue against hosting a bank? How do you claim that's threatening the alliance? You can't. Which is why Washington's response has been mostly quiet frustration rather than open opposition. But here's the twist that changes everything. If Canada succeeds with this model, the precedent applies everywhere. The NATO Innovation Fund could be headquartered in Poland. Arctic defense coordination could run through Oslo. Mediterranean security financing could operate from Madrid. Each would follow the same logic Canada is using now. We have the expertise. We have the infrastructure. We're a reliable ally. We should host the institution. Once that pattern establishes, American financial centrality in NATO dissolves. Not through confrontation, through distribution. Power doesn't shift to a single alternative center. It fragments across multiple capitals, each managing different aspects of alliance operations. Washington remains important, but no longer monopolistic. That's the real transformation we're watching, not Canada versus America. Canada pioneering a model that makes the entire alliance less dependent on any single country's financial infrastructure, and doing it in a way that actually strengthens collective defense by creating redundancy and resilience. Documents reveal this is exactly what Mark Carney argued in his Davos speech. Middle powers need to build independent capacity and form flexible coalitions. They can't rely on the old order's protection because that order no longer functions reliably. They need to create new structures that work regardless of great power instability. The DSRB bid is that theory in practice. Canada building financial infrastructure, Canada forming coalitions with European and Indo-Pacific partners, Canada demonstrating that middle powers can manage critical alliance functions without great power supervision. It's working. Other countries are already inquiring about similar models. And here's what Washington is slowly realizing. This isn't something they can stop. Canada isn't violating treaty obligations. They're not building rival institutions. They're competing for official NATO infrastructure using legitimate arguments about capability and commitment. If America tries to block it, they look like they're putting national interest above alliance solidarity. If they let it happen, they accept the precedent that diminishes American financial centrality. Either way, the monopoly breaks. The question is just timing. And Canada has positioned itself to benefit regardless. Because even if Montreal or Toronto doesn't win this specific bid, they've demonstrated capabilities and ambitions that will shape future competitions. Officials are now saying that Kevin Reid, the DSRB development president, believes Canada has a really strong chance at winning. Royal Bank of Canada was the first global bank to sign on as a development partner. Canada's delegation to initial briefings was the largest of any country. The infrastructure is there. The political will is there. The expertise is proven. What happens when a country that everyone assumed would remain America's financial satellite starts actively competing for the institutions that shape Western defense policy? You get exactly what we're seeing now. A fundamental restructuring of alliance power dynamics. A shift from hierarchy to network. A transition from American monopoly to distributed authority. Mark Carney's vision for Canadian sovereignty isn't rhetorical. It's structural, it's patient, it's professional, and it's working. The DSRB bid is just the most visible example of a broader strategy that's been developing for months. Financial independence, strategic positioning, building capacity that gives Canada options regardless of American policy chaos. The West's financial geography is being redrawn, and Canada isn't waiting for permission to draw some of those new lines themselves. That's the story. That's what happened on February 3rd when Montreal made their announcement. Not just a bid for a bank, a declaration of financial sovereignty that signals Canada's transformation from dependent ally to independent power. I'm curious what you think about this. Does Canada's move strengthen NATO by creating financial redundancy, or does it fragment the alliance in ways that could weaken collective defense? Where do you see this going in the next decade? Let me know in the comments.